Thank you.
So this is this would be a good time to transition to our panel discussion. Um, if the speakers who would like to join might turn their camera on. And so the questions that we have here for the panel discussion, we've slotted 30 minutes to talk about one question, 30 minutes for another question, and 30 minutes for a free dialogue between all the speakers. Um, and so these questions, they relate to how dialectical thinking impacts biology on various levels of organization. But I could well see the conversation, perhaps towards the end, moving in the direction of how dialectical thinking or dialectical logic can affect things like AI, like Dr. Arnold is talking about, or computation in general, where computation perhaps has been based on binary logic and how a dialectical framework would influence that. For those who have the capacity to speak about those things, I don't think, I don't know how much I would be able to contribute to that, but it's very interesting. And also a point that both Dr. Wirz brought up and Dr. Arnold about Gestalt. What is the relevance of Gestalt? Perhaps how does Gestalt affect our discussions of telos in nature? I think that might be an interesting avenue as well. Um, but let's start with this first question. I'll read it aloud and please feel free to go in whatever direction you feel appropriate. So, question one is about the limits of dialectical knowing. Several contributions from today highlight the movement toward a holistic, integrated conceptual framework, sometimes approaching the absolute. How should we understand the role of systemic limits or thresholds in dialectical development? Moments where a system cannot internally resolve its own tensions until a transformation occurs, e.g., conceptual, sublation, ecological regime shift, or evolutionary leap. Could such limits be intrinsic sources of creativity? And how might they inform the way we theorize knowledge, resilience, or change in living systems? I'll go ahead and copy and paste the question into the chat here, and feel free to speak freely.
Can you repeat that last part of that sentence? Oh, you're going to put that up here. Okay, that's
I'm
good.
going to put it in the chat. Yeah, just give me
Okay,
one.
thanks.
So, exit slideshow, program, and let's see. Okay, question. Chat. And okay, there it is. Yeah, I think an important point in this kind of discussion is the idea of constraints being both restricting and enabling, right?
Hmm.
Which is mentioned several times in the talks today. Um, so, how to determine the limits?
Exactly. This is the question which Julie and I have come up with, and it brings us back to the idea of what a system is in terms of what we see as an entity of actualized potentiality, right? We see a system unfolding, there's tangible stuff. We can measure species, we can measure decomposition processes. So this is everything which one way or the other is tangible. It's no longer pure potentiality, right? So we have this system, we need to imagine it as this bubble or membrane which I talked about, which operates with with its own system logic, if you will, and it resides within the system knowledge where the incompleteness comes in. Every system by its own is incomplete, and from within itself, it is not able to resolve in an absolute way any kind of tension that will pop up, right? If you will, we can talk about blind spots in a system to which the system itself is blind, but potentially through an outside view, you can make this blind spot possible. And once they become possible, you open a source for making enter new potentialities from outside the bubble, from this big sea of Aristotelian immanence, if you will, and from a sort of quantum field, if we can use again a quantum metaphor. And from this outside, bring then new stuff, whatever this is in, and actualize it due to a process which entails novel forms of co-construction of what is already there, the memory, right, of a system, legacy effects, plus what comes now in from outside as the new potentiality, and you recombine this in a way to have a new system dynamic coming up. And as such, you perhaps in dialectical logic, you expand the bubble in this kind of sense, it becomes bigger. Or perhaps it might even result that the bubble collapses completely and a sort of complete new bubble comes up. So this is a little bit what we wanted to formulate with these questions. Where are the limits? What can the bubble metaphor in this sense allow us to envision how, at least in ecosystems or perhaps in any kind of complex adaptive systems, dynamic operate under its blind spots, where tensions arise due to factors that are either known or unknown. Perhaps we can bring in thinking around known knowns, unknown knowns, known unknowns, but potentially also unknown unknowns, right? So it's a little bit going down this road, how incompleteness in the broadest sense allows us to navigate tensions in terms of what we know and what we don't know.
If I may suggest, I think it's pivotal to start with the role of the thinker posing the question before we arrive at any details of the determinate knowledge of the system that is being observed.
Exactly,
I
yeah.
think you have to start with the
So,
interest of the
so
thinker.
the interest here is, and as I am, this relates to the interlude I had in my presentation about Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems, a system which is impossible due to its own limits to resolve any kind of tension that might arise. That's a kind of paraphrasing what Gödel has come up with. But the impossibility of a system from within to cover all these blind spots that might be there. So this relates from the mathematical formal logic, which I think has definitely also applications to macro systems. So its relevance as a heuristic extends way beyond the world of mathematics and the formal of a formal logic to complex system dynamics in general. So essentially, the rooting, the foundation here is Kurt Gödel's work, Kurt Gödel's incompleteness.
Maybe I have a very naive question. Would it help to look back at our not so far away past? Imagine some 12,000 years ago, Europe was basically on ice, under ice. Huh? And then temperature started to get warmer. What happened? We had forests in the middle of Europe everywhere. So this was kind of a system, closed system. And then all of a sudden, people arrived, cleared the woods to start agriculture. So a new thing, and there were amazing tensions between nature and farming. But we know that farming activity created a diversity that has never been seen before. And when we go on, then all of a sudden, these small farmer scale unities became larger and larger and larger. And all of a sudden, now the diversity farming has created is going to disappear. I don't want to go further and further, but what can we learn? How then? We had collapses of bubbles, we had integrations of these bubbles, etc., etc. I think it might be helpful.
Mhm. Oh, it is definitely a nice example, also very practical and contemporary, relevant in a sustainability sense. Um, and it's perhaps a good starting point to frame the sequel in terms of, all right, we are kind of in a period where we have a growing world population, which is growing more and more hungry at the same time where food production becomes more uncertain under climate change, perhaps, if you will. So can we, from if within our current epistemic frames of the knowledge we have within our sciences in a very broad sense, are we really able to predict how things will change? I mean, this brings us back to a
Mhm.
hot area of research and resilient science, which is early warning indicators. So we use early warning indication to predict such regime shifts we have been talking about, like a lake shifting from clear water to turbid, like potentially the whole planet shifting from a Holocene climate into a hothouse Earth. Um, but those where do those early warning signals come from if we work under incompleteness, right? They must be somewhere coming from. And if we think in these Gödelian terms, this is perhaps only possible if we think as of our system now being a closed entity, which starts to open up channels and lets new potentialities, new ideas, new given facts come in to the system, right? But this is something which comes from the outside. It's not generated system internally. So this puts the whole foundation of early warning systems on shaky ground. If you have those blind spots internally, if you don't really know how those early warnings work because you're blind to them, system internally, and you depend from outside information, uh, are those early warnings somehow really bound to fail in the long run and we can't predict anything? Which kind of makes sense because if you look at Stuart Kaufman's non-ergodic universe or adjacent possibilities, more or less, his idea was the universe evolution is so creative you cannot predict it in any possible way. He takes here pretty much of a hardcore stance, right? And it kind of makes sense if you combine Gödel with Stuart Kaufman's idea in this context.
Mhm.
Another problem might come back to what you were saying earlier, but about there being, and a point Hegel makes, I think, in the phenomenology, about there being a limit to our knowledge, right? We have to acknowledge some distinction between what goes on in the world and what we see. In the phenomenology, I think Hegel argues that that knowledge is always based in the life of a species, in our case, of course, the human species. So what we can see, what we can know, is in some sense dependent on what we are as a species, and that that poses more problems when we're trying to think about making predictions about the what we think of as the system, the ecological system, which is bigger than just what we can see, I would say. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
Can I add something? I don't know. Um, I hope not to distract from where we've been, but I'm thinking In evolutionary epistemology, there's discussion of the evolution of the mechanisms of our mind. So, I mean, this is a different route than Hegel goes, that give us some capacity for processing information the way we do, and so on. And then, of course, there's the evolutionary of the evolution of theories. And so, one lens we have for the world are, I don't know, our biological uh, senses and maybe a natural capacity for language building and so on. But then we have like scientific theories, right? So on the one hand, there's going to be limits to what we as a physical system can perceive. So we don't have the sonar of bats and things like, or the uh, of bat. We don't have the same perception as bats. Dogs can hear tones that are outside of our frequency, and so there's stuff going out in the universe that's not, available to us. So there's that at a biological level. And then, I'm kind of thinking about, well, how do we evaluate then this theory development? I mean, you have a lot of thinkers like Peirce and Dewey, and I think Popper had more of this sensibility that and Hegel, I think that there's a steady progression of knowledge in theory. And if you take Karl Popper as a kind of contrast, well, no, maybe it's a paradigm. It's like I don't know, it's like a fish. A paradigm is like a fish net that you put out there that helps you get at some things in the world, but little fishes are going to kind of slip through that too. You're not going to get everything in it. And in the Popperian kind of framework, it's like, well, you might just be busting your head up against some anomaly that can't be explained by this paradigm. And so now you get a kind of a revolution in thought rather than a steady evolution. And so here I'm wondering, how much does Hegel, if that's right, is that right? I mean, I read that book as a kid and thought it was pretty impressive. It's a long time ago. But he took back a lot of the things that he was saying about it. But if you get like now a new kind of theory that allows you to explain the old anomaly and so on, what he argues is it renders some of the earlier questions irrelevant. You ask a different kind of question about the world than you would have asked under the earlier theory or under the earlier paradigm. Um, Hegel has a much more continuitous view of how we're progressing. It's a continuity through history, whereas Kuhn is saying no, it's much more disruptive than that. You get some kind of a revolution, and I don't know, and you get a new theory. To go back to that evolutionary epistemology stuff, that evolution of a new theory here. I mean, which reframes questions and so on. I don't know. I'm just putting that out there.
Hmm.
Limits lead to kind of the need to rethink things kind of almost from the ground up in that case. Now, is that correct? Did Hegel get it more correct than Kuhn?
I think in a discussion of how to determine boundaries of systems, especially in regard to Hegel's philosophy, we should also think about his discussions on the impotence of nature, or the incompleteness of nature, such that is there really such a thing as a closed system to begin with? Relatively so, but not in an absolute sense. And if there isn't something, so in the sphere of nature at least, right? So within the sphere of nature, if there is no such thing as a closed system, absolutely, then how we can never actually draw absolute boundaries of any systems. So if the interest of asking such questions is to deal with human problems like food scarcity or environmental degradation, then as important as those problems are to humanity, they're relative problems, and the definition of systems to try to correct those problems is also going to be relative. So then any evaluation of objective nature as it is, it will also be relative to our interest in what we're looking to get out of it. And I think that's important to recognize, because the views that led to the problems in the world of food scarcity are probably impoverished views of systems taken as absolute, right? So even if we just become a little more humble about the abundance of the possibility to grow food, and how such food is distributed, without taking into consideration, capitalist values and competition of, market competition of nations trying to be superior than other, resulting in people going hungry when other nations have a surplus. All these kind of considerations are completely based on the psychology of the people asking them, on how we define the relative limits of the systems compared to how we're asking the questions. And I think it's all restricted, coming from a more spiritual dimension. I think it's all restricted then. All our questions are restricted to the plane of birth and death. In the Vedas, there's a lot of emphasis on recognizing the limitations of acting, of consciously being absorbed too much in the dealings of birth and death, and trying to strive for understanding systems in a more eternal sense. And maybe that's outside the scope of what we want to talk about here, but I think it's relevant to at least mention that this drive for survival, which we've all talked about throughout our discussions today, which is so inherent in every form of life, is itself a contradiction, right? At the human form of life, we know death is inevitable, yet this drive to survive fuels all of life on Earth. Why is this drive to survive so strong and fundamental when death is always going to occur? From the Vedic point of view, they say that drive is the inherent drive of an eternal soul that is not in the environment it's meant to be in. That the lacking that's produced in nature of death, this lacking of a consciousness of what is eternal, is driving that survival instinct. We want to live, we want to keep on living, but we don't find ourselves in an environment where it's possible to do so. Anyhow, I don't want to get too much into it if it's not of an interest to talk about, but I just wanted to throw that into the ring.
Oh, I think it's really relevant and interesting, because you touch on a topic also where, the science as an objective truth-seeking thing sort of is not enough when we deal with all those big questions about ecological regime shifts tipping into a hothouse Earth, right? It's a little bit like, imagine you have depression. You suffer from depression. And you explain to someone what depression is. A person who has never suffered depression, him or herself, does not know what you're talking about. They understand the words, but they never have the felt experience. They can't resonate ultimately with anything you're talking about, because it is this lack of empirical exposure. Having the felt experience becomes so fundamental also as a form of knowing. But ask science, how do you quantify depression? There are indicators, right? But it's also such a small representation of what this overarching emergent sense perception of a depression is. Imagine like you turn this is I think a metaphor from Henri Bergson, a French philosopher. You can turn your level of perception to a completely other realm. Just as a radio, you put the bandwidth from one range to another. You move completely outside this frame. So a person who suffers depression moves away from the normal world, and normal relative to all of us who do not have depression, right? and gets apprehended in a phenomenologically different world where the sense perceptions become so, I don't even want to say distorted, just so different, right? There's an other alternate reality, so to speak, which science will never be able to fully explain. So when it comes down to all those big questions, I think phenomenology might play increasingly an important role also somehow for preparing people when all those big catastrophes happen. This is where ecology right now is falling completely short. We talk about all these shifts. We talk about wars that might ensue. We talk about hunger periods that might follow. But people perceive this also remote and never identify with that. So what should the ecological discourse potentially advocate? Okay, people, get together, hide yourself out in the cold every day. Feel what the cold is. Don't eat for 3 days. Feel what hunger is, right? And as such, develop a knowledge basis which is outside the realm of science per se, but still aligned with a broader way of interacting with and perceiving nature as the human beings we have been conceived by it, and as such, yeah, they're simply relevant to start to be also more humble. And I think this is where objective sciences simply cannot do the trick. This is where the spirituality. I myself embarked on a spiritual journey many years ago, and it helped me to refine these ideas about what it really means to be human, right? It's not only facts, it's the feeling, it's the exposure, it's the becoming part of all these wonders that surround us somehow, right? But this is where science sort of falls short in giving us good guidance right now. So what at least we need in resilience research, social ecological resilience, ecosystem science is sort of a more of a of post-foundational approaches, which kind of bring in also this other form of knowledge domains, which are not purely objectivity based, which are essentially entangled, as we discussed. Everything correlates, co-constructs, is processual. It's all at the end stabilized processes, which, yeah, as soon as the configuration fields change, become something new. So it's not all about ultimate matter kind of approaches, tangible things. Nature is complex, but it's also something which governance and management needs to understand. And this is where we ecologists are having a very hard time giving people a gray zone picture instead of black white solutions they want. I'm digressing a little bit.
Very, very
One of the unique things about Hegel as a thinker is his insistence. This is part of what made him so influential in philosophy. His insistence on the temporality of knowledge, right? That knowledge is always limited to time and place, um, at least for human beings. Um, and and it's only at the end of time that, for Hegel, in my view, where you will get the full picture, or outside of time that you will get the full picture. And also, when you were talking, David, it reminded me of a passage in Hegel where he distinguishes between the concept of forgiveness that a child would have, where they understand the word, as you were saying, Johannes, and the concept of forgiveness that an old man would have after a life in which, wrong had to be constantly forgiven, or one had various responses to the wrongs that, a whole life of lived experience would give one a very different idea of forgiveness from what you would get in a dictionary definition, which a child could understand. That role of experience in producing different kinds of knowledge. Yeah.
I believe that knowledge is had not only a time dimension, but also a space dimension. And there is so much knowledge around we don't have any idea of. Just to give you an example, the FAO, the Food Organization of the United Nations, says that 80% of the world population is nourished by farmers with less than 2 hectares arable land. Smallest farmers feed the world and not the big high-tech company. Still, we have this image and we hear it every day. We need all industrial agriculture to save the world. It's just to save the profit of these companies. And now, interestingly enough, this maybe unconscious and not scientific knowledge in the sense of European or Western tradition is also the knowledge that creates the highest of biodiversity possible. So the hotspots of biodiversity are all in these places with small-scale farmers. And this brings me to the point where we should ask how can we integrate this knowledge and somehow empower the people with that knowledge to really go on. And this for me is not so much a philosophical question, but it is an ethical question. And it would be interesting to see how a system should be built. And I always hear Schumacher, who says, think globally, act locally. And what we see in our days is the opposite. Huh? We think locally and act globally. There is one of the reasons for the big crisis we have to face today. And I don't know how philosophers like Hegel would go on with these situations and question now. So what I want to say is there are so many systems where the friction or the contact is much more important than everything we are discussing within our Western cultural, economic, social tradition. And how can we start to get shift in our mindset to include all knowledge that exists in the world, to acknowledge what is there, and to empower people to develop this knowledge, and not to impose our fundamental value. And we have heard it from you, Daniel, loss and profit. Yeah.
If I could add, I don't know, those are really interesting insights. You know, I'm thinking about, I'll go back to the depression example. You know, now if you have depression, we can look at that from lots of lenses. So you know, so a psychiatrist would come in and say, okay, take these tablets. You know, the brain's being, you got a chemical imbalance, or you go to a psychoanalyst, and it depends on what kind of psychoanalysis they're doing. You know, they might say, deal with childhood trauma, or and that's going to help you kind of find wholeness again. You might find somebody else who says, well, you need to take walks and go do something you find valuable right now. And so all these lenses, so we have these disciplines where we don't have a kind of a unified theory that is dominant in that discipline, like a lot of the soft sciences, or, you know, social sciences. And so we have a problem, and we have 11 solutions from the dominant, you know, 11 paradigms. I'm making up numbers, obviously, you know, a handful of different views about what you need to do to address that problem. And then you can look at that same problem from a spiritual point of view and say, well, no, well, you need some mindfulness exercises or do some yoga. And that's going to kind of help you kind of kind of develop this kind of sensibility of your interconnectedness that you don't tend to have with you, where you're feeling so isolated. So yeah, it's the individual lens now, and these, if I go back to my, you know, evolutionary epistemological stuff, these are kind of theories for different domains, and you know, and then they create sorts of limits. And so I guess what you could do is, if you have the depression and you try one of these out and you say, well, that's not working very well, then you try the other one on. So the limit of that lens is, well, I got to try on another lens, and then, well, none of that's working. So I guess I'll go to the yoga center, or I'm going to go to the Vedanta center, and now you're trying to figure out some way to kind of break through and overcome um, your depression. So I think, yeah, somehow we have lenses that we adopt for all of these things, and I guess I'll stop with that. Thanks for your interesting comments, everybody. I enjoyed what you all had to say.
To keep the momentum of this going, I'm going to put the second question in the chat because it's actually in line with the direction of where this conversation has gone naturally, and I'll read it aloud. And so we were also just joined by Bharti Carla Hines, who here in New Jersey, she's an active community leader who has wellness centers in the New Brunswick area near Rutgers University. So it's also nice to have people who are in the community trying to lead efforts aligned with these kinds of purposes and thoughts that we're talking about right now. So welcome, Carla. So question 2 is dialectics under constraint building. Dialectics under constraint. Building on the discussions of niche construction, organism-environment dialectic, and social-ecological transformations, to what extent does dialectical movement in natural systems occur freely versus being shaped or bound by constraint conditions, biophysical, evolutionary, epistemic? Might the interplay between freedom and constraint itself be a dialectical, where limits do not hinder development, but actually structure the field of possibility? And so somehow I'm feeling like this is a discussion about the constraints on future educational systems. What is that supposed to look like to meet these needs of the questions being asked? Because educational system is a constraint, I think, right? So, but how does it need to differ from educational systems today in order to adequately address the problems that have just been talked about?
Will you paste that question in here?
Yeah, I put it in the chat, Dr. Arnold.
Okay.
Yeah.
One thing I was thinking about was that there's been quite a bit of talk in the disability studies literature about the social construction of mental distress. We don't call it mental illness because that already implies a certain construction of the experience. And there's been discussion of how after some typically natural disaster, sometimes man-made disaster such as genocide, the various countries in the West will send over psychiatrists, to try to help out. And that the local populations ended up sending them away because all they wanted us to do was sit in a dark room and talk about our trauma instead of when we wanted to be outside with our community and have a big party and celebrate and dance, right? And this is what we think of as the solution to our mental distress, um, and and then relying, as you were saying, Johannes, on to what degree are we integrating knowledges from other places into our understanding of phenomenon and the need to take seriously other constructions of the world, other arrangements, other solutions. I think I also do African philosophy, and that's one of the things that has really interested me over the years. And I think that's a really important lesson. Be it, as Kierkegaard might say, please be a human being, which means understanding your own limitations, your own place, your own time, and and taking seriously other places and other times in thinking about the world and solutions. It also reminded me of I lived in the Soviet Union when I was a kid. My father was in the diplomatic service, and it was always a big joke that 80% of the Soviet Union's um, farm production came from the small plots of land that people had around their houses. And the collective farms were almost useless in terms of their actual production of food. We used to, in Moscow, people would bring their trucks in and open up the back, and they would just sell their produce and stuff to people on the street who walked up. But anyway, I'll stop.
Mm.
Mm.
The interesting point here is how do we define freedom and what is constraint? Perhaps in the context of yeah, following up on this, is there any dialectical relationship between freedom and constraints? Can freedom sublate constraint and vice versa? Is this possible? And the kind of an example that pops up in my mind right now is the Arabic Spring, right? Freedom was supposed to be attained by toppling all those corrupt autocrats, right? Like Gaddafi in Libya, most recently Assad in Syria. But then history has told us, okay, you kind of create freedom, but things have gotten worse than before. And you still work under deeply entrenched constraints, which have not really solved the issue, but made it even more terrible, like the conflicts between all those different Arabic political factions. You know, the tensions seem to be stronger than before. So it's interesting, perhaps from a definitional perspective, what is freedom and what is constraint? I mean, also perhaps into the game enters the picture of free will. Is there something like free will that can contribute to freedom? Do we not live all in a pseudo imagination of being free? We are not free if you think you need to wake up every morning at 6 a.m. to go to your job, to do the 8 hours in a boring office, which you hate profoundly. Is there something of free will to it? Or uh, so that I'm getting too much down a rabbit hole, but not sure if these points make sense and if they contribute something interesting to the discussion. So just throwing them out here.
Oh, well, I think discussions about mental distress and depression, like you were having before, and discussions about freedom, I think are very related and relevant to responses to ecological degradation and any kind of worldly suffering. So I think these are definitely relevant questions to be asking in this context, especially. And
Mhm.
I think distinguishing between political freedom and even freedom in the sense of having leisure time are very different. Again, I'm very deeply influenced by this Vedic perspective. So from that perspective, freedom is determined in relation to how we identify with ourselves in a fundamental way. If we identify ourselves as islands unto ourself, as John Donne said in his famous poem, rather than being parts of the main, to think of ourselves in an isolated sense is to basically cut ourselves off from any sense of freedom in the real sense of the word freedom. And it's only through recognition on our inherent reliance on that which is beyond ourself that we can attain any kind of freedom in a meaningful sense. Of course, Hegel tells us that freedom is to see oneself in the other. From the Vedanta perspective, just to put it very plainly, freedom is seen when we understand our role as servants of God or Krishna, meaning there's a whole which is beyond us that we have functional relation to, and our freedom is attained through submission to a functional relation with the whole. So these kind of ideas that our freedom is inherently dependent upon our recognition of relationship and co-constitutive becoming is central to any kind of phenomenological experience of freedom being a means of overcoming mental distress or overcoming worldly fights for resources. That's my contribution to the point, I think.
Maybe I'll take up what you said about Hegel in some sense. I mean, if we look at Plato, I'll get to Hegel via Plato. You have the allegory of the cave. We're not free insofar as we're not rationally thinking and we're giving into conventions. I guess that might mean that we impose these constraints on ourselves that we don't have to. They're not. Um, uh, but it's through thinking that you kind of get this freedom. Now, um, the Hegelian version, I think, is also that it's thinking that sort of sets you free, but it's over the long course of history, and it's not just thinking. Thinking manifests itself in creating new political systems that advance toward freedom, and then there's recognition in the process of history. So, kind of freedom comes at the end of this historical process from a Hegelian perspective, I think. And I don't know where that it gets us from right here. If we're not there, then we're not as free as we could be, I guess. He's very optimistic. It's that there's this kind of progress that's going on. Um, so I'll start with that. But then, to come back to some of your other comments, um, I think we could talk about physical constraints to our freedom that as bodies of a particular kind, right? And so I'm not free to fly I'm not free to jump out of a window and flap my arms, but I mean, I guess we have figured out over the course of history how we could build an airplane and we could fly. So that gave we were pretty set on that, and we figured out a way to do it, or some of us did. And so there's those physical constraints. Those might give rise to creative solutions in some cases. Some of those things you're not going to be free to do. There's the Hobbesian view of freedom is you just have if somebody's not kind of taken your ability to move away, basically, then you're free. Um, but but I think what we've been talking about is kind of maybe the most interesting, which is you can have these internal constraints. So maybe you've internalized some views of yourself, and so you're not even free to be happy because you don't have never figured out that that's an option for you or somebody else. And so you need to kind of throw off your paradigm, however you do that, and adopt a different one. Is that through psychoanalysis? Is that you manage that? Is that through meditation or mindfulness training? Is it through joining the, folk club? I don't know. So that's my flurry of thoughts about this kind of stuff.
Hmm.
Dialectics also suggests that there can be resources within a system that help to produce the next system. And this is one of the things I think that's been interesting in some of the feminist discussions of for example, some of the ways in which the West and Western thinkers go into a a culture and offer criticisms of it without thinking of the resources within the culture that already exists to call it into question. So I can't think of it. I was trying. There's this wonderful movie, African movie about a woman who comes to oppose feminine genital mutilation not because some Western person told her that it was wrong, but because of her own perspective, her own experience. And the story is about her refusal to let her daughter undergo this procedure. And of course, she's subject to various kinds of social pressures and so on and so forth. But that's also, the idea of the limitations of a system itself producing its self-sublation, right? The sort of some internal resources that allow for a change to a new system also. And that's something that comes back to this idea of relying on local knowledges and local ways of thinking to help produce solutions to problems that they face and that we face.
On the other hand, I'm thinking that's, I think, really important, and that both Johannes and you have mentioned, um, Julie. On the other hand, I'm thinking of Hegel. So I think it's in the Philosophy of Right, where he's talking about Napoleon's laws, and they try to institute them in Spain. And he says, well, Spain isn't kind of up to them. They're more rational than what Spain has, but the community in Spain is not able to see the rationality of these. And so they're not going to be able to implement them. So you've got a kind of view that he's expressing that, well, some people are kind of further along on the zeitgeist than others, and there's kind of now I don't know how I got there from where you were. But there can be that too with any given society, that a society needs to learn something, that needs to, and the ways that they interact aren't optimal, and have sort of modes of behavior that are um, expressing dominance of different social groups within those and so on. Anyway, I'm just thinking of that and kind of striking the balance. I think that this is in the post-colonial literature, pretty interesting, you know. There's a book, what is it? Aesthetic Education in the Age of Globalization by Spivak. I don't know, she's a literature professor from Columbia. She had the chair of uh, well, anyway, a chair there. And she talks about, well, how does a culture kind of take and learn from the West in some ways, some things that are good to learn from the West, and retain its dignity and find the resources that it has within its own culture that should be preserved and um, you know, um, spread, and kind of finding that balance, like between kind of reading Shakespeare and saying, no, we don't need to read Shakespeare here. We're going to we have our own authors to read. Um, Hegel is Hegel is not a kind and generous spirit in this sense, right? So he talks about the slaughter bench of history, and he has the idea that, you've got this
Yeah.
zeitgeist, which is at the forefront, and everybody sort of needs to catch up. And I think that doesn't align with too many sensibilities that we have these days. I think he underappreciated very much on what we might call, well, these other kind of knowledge systems, right? Um, Including the Vedas. I mean, he writes about the Bhagavad Gita, but not very complimentary. Uh, um, and so. That's a place where probably most of us would criticize Hegel for this kind of Eurocentrism, um, in his perspective, that doesn't reach down far enough. And yet, on the other hand, I think there's a point that, systems can learn from each other. We have some things not only to learn from other people, but also to teach them in some cases. Now, we've found ourselves too much in the role of teachers and of unwilling students, if you will, and teaching maybe things that nobody should ever learn, right? And so kind of miseducating, swaths of the world or whatever. And so, um, yeah. I do think there's a point, though, that even with all of our failures, we do have something to teach some places and so on. We've been doing that, but we also have a lot to learn that I think we've been reluctant to acknowledge, and that Hegel's very reluctant to acknowledge.
If I could add one point, I reread the question and something that Dr. Puri mentioned comes to mind that's very relevant about. So, how does the interplay between freedom and constraint itself be dialectic, where limits do not hinder development but structure the field of possibility? He would always discuss the example of if we're thinking of freedoms in terms of an individual can express themselves in a way that doesn't hinder the self expression of others, then to have that, you need to have laws in a society that would stop somebody from coming and killing someone else for acting in such a way. So the laws of the society of, whatever those laws are, help. Law is a constraint on action, but that constraint helps to facilitate the expression of self in such a way that we're expressing ourselves in ways that doesn't inhibit the self-expression
Of
of
other.
others. But
Yeah.
of course, it becomes a little. I mean, I don't have. Perhaps I just don't possess the nuance that he used when he described this to me. Because, of course, by telling somebody else you can't kill somebody for expressing themselves, you're inhibiting the self-expression of somebody else. But I think that general principle speaks to the question, at least.
Maybe what I want to share is not very philosophical, but I agree with you, Krishna, that this is exactly what I understand by freedom. But of course, not. I'm not free to kill somebody. I will come to that later. And in our philosophy, we say the realm of freedom is always bound to humanities or Geistesleben. I don't know how to translate. I don't want to say spiritual life, but maybe it is. And then we must make sure that on the societal level, we really have, how do you say, equality? Everybody is the same, has the same rights. And on the economic level, in our philosophy, the most important principle is sharing, the opposite of loss and profit. This is maybe well, we are not there, I say. We are not there. Now, another nice word by Steiner, who has written this book, Philosophy of Freedom, from a, I would say, European Western perspective. He says, true knowledge is only possible by a free human being. So there are certain types of knowledge, the one you learn in school, sometimes you don't believe, and the one you really create. And we could discuss a little bit how Stein thinks knowledge or knowing is created. And then he says a funny thing in this book, Philosophy of Freedom. Knowledge turned into action is love. We can meditate on that, but it is amazing. So the free human being, when he transforms this state or condition of freedom, is doing something in the world, and what he does in the world is kind of love. And love is something that is not stays not in my heart usually, but flows out. Yeah? So this individualization, knowing how I am, and of course, freedom is not a state, it's kind of a happening or a process, and we can fall out and fall in again. So this is something we have to achieve ourselves, but the impacts or consequences of our freedom is shared with the world.
The idea that knowledge and being are in service to love is, I think,
Yeah,
very important for
yeah.
this discussion.
And Goethe, the friend of Hegel, said, the world is never complete, never perfect, has never come to an end. Man himself must bring it to an end, not by knocking the world down, but by knowing. what is going on in the world. So knowledge is, so to speak, um, knowledge, this means understand what is out there, how is it working out there, so to speak, the crown of what God have created.
Dr. Wirz, what you're saying is actually very much aligned with the Vedantic teachings. The Vedanta tells that fundamentally reality has three elements: Sat, Chit, Ananda. Existence, knowledge of existence, and fulfillment of existence, or existence, consciousness, and bliss, like the bliss of love. And they're a hierarchical. Satchitananda is a hierarchical thing where that bliss, that love at the end is what subsumes both the consciousness and the existence, the sat and the chit. The ananda is what is considered supreme. So what you're saying is very much in line with that principle.
Mhm. Hmm.
Hello,
Carla.
everyone.
Yes, welcome, Carla.
Hi,
Hello.
thank you. And pardon me, I was just wrapping up a previous event. Well, it's a blessing to be here. And pardon me, I just saw the message not long ago and wasn't even sure it was still going on. So thank you. That's the timing is just perfect. I've been enjoying the discourse the entire time, and I appreciate this kind of space. Wonderful space. This particular focus here, with this particular question, the lens, and I love the idea of lenses because it's just a wonderful way to get outside of yourself and just widen the mind a bit more. And for me, this freedom and constraint, I feel they are absolutely they're dance partners. They have to have a relationship with each other. Again, in my view of things, when I look at just from the lens of the movement and the relationship of things in the cosmos, we enjoy the way the water flows because of the presence of the riverbank. We enjoy even the way that the light plays on the leaves and the trees and the jagged edges of the mountains because of the presence of the shadows.
Mhm.
So it just when I step back in that way, I find it to be another opportunity to explore. Oh, there's a dance here. There is ultimately a relationship, and that's very contextual. And so, looking to apply in different situations or different cultures, different civilizations, it really does. Excuse me, it really does require, in my opinion, that view of, well, what is actually present here. And one of the speakers talked about the existing resources, I believe was the term that was used. Well, in the context, whether it's the the riverbed and the riverbank and the water, and whether it's the jagged edges of the mountain and the sunlight, what's already present here, and what is the relationship here? I find for me that it's just practicing that neutrality as one individual human and as a human that works with others inside of groups and organizations. I try to bring that down to a very practical way of applying that. And it does require a certain amount of neutrality because it means I ought to walk into the situation not necessarily needing anything, one way or the other. And we talk about the kleshas, the five kleshas. We're either pushing things away, or we're drawing things toward us, but there's always like this need for something when we present ourselves, whether as individuals or as society, as Dr. Arnold there referenced the amount of times we impose ourselves as teachers to students who never actually even agreed to be students. But walking into or looking at what is already in existence with the perspective of, well, what's actually already here? Because universally, cosmologically, I understand that there's always a dance at play. There's always a call and response. There's always a kirtan, essentially, this call and response of the ways that all things move. And so if that is the truth, or if that is at least the perspective I'm willing to adopt, then how can I apply that here? What's already here? How does what's already here actually dance with each other? What's that relationship? And then staying in that place of neutrality. Now there's room for what's already present to arise. So to whatever level that helps to contribute, to me, I just wanted to share that it's an it's a it's an application I strive to use often, and on those multiple levels, as one human, as a human within a group, as a human with a wellness program inside of a school where we're working on I call it cultural strategic planning. Where we look to through the work of on an individual level, help to better shape, construct, enliven, and strengthen the culture of the organization. So thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So this has been such a rich discussion. Is there interest in continuing on to a discussion of Gestalt? And so this would change, I mean, this would, I guess, kind of change direction from the momentum that we've been going in. But is there an interest in talking about what Gestalt, what we mean by that Gestalt, and how it relates to telos at various levels of organization? Or is, at this point, do we feel like it's not worth getting into that kind of discussion? How does everybody feel?
I wouldn't mind making one comment before we do, if we do move in that direction. Um, but I don't know how you all feel. What's the time clock look like? We had another 15 minutes. Is that about what we're looking at?
Yeah, so 12:50 would be the allotted time slot that we agreed to, which is ultimately is about 40 minutes earlier than the conference was originally scheduled for, but obviously there's no need to artificially make it longer because one of our speakers didn't show up.
Yeah.
But we have about 20 minutes if we want to stick to 12:50, and yeah. So
I wonder if I can try to make my comment in a way that twists into that question a little bit.
please, yeah,
And then, everybody else can decide what they want to do.
sounds good.
After
Yeah, sounds good.
that, if that's okay. So, Carla, thanks for your comments. I like that, you're thinking about freedom in reference to the individual, and then also in reference to some social groups. So, I think there are these spiritual traditions that are sometimes more individualistic, and it's like, okay, well, it's just about and within every kind of major tradition, you find these that are more personalistic and that are more social. Like you just go off and you save yourself, if I want to put it in those terms, and or you just meditate and then you're good and you reach your enlightenment, and it's not that much necessarily in certain variations of these things about affecting other people. Um, um, or the evangelical Christian who is saved, and it's like the rest of the world's kind of going to hell in a handbasket. So that's a very personal sense of what freedom is about. Um, um, but other um, other views, like Hegel's, connects it to our social life and the social life over a long course of history. Um, and, there's this idea that, um, well, I'm going to go back to this. So let me just say that. So, as selves, we can have constraints that we place upon ourselves, right? And maybe it's because we don't know enough. I mean, somebody only exposed to certain ideas might um, think that their salvation just requires a good belief, the right belief in the right story or something like that. And maybe they need exposure to some other ideas. For some reason, they have that mental constraint and they, I believe, are mistaken about what their freedom consists in. Um, and and then other constraints are from emotional needs. And so, there's a process of growth. You kind of have a sense of what your freedom is, and you make your means toward reaching it, and then maybe you find, well, I'm not free. This isn't free me after all, and so you need to set a kind of reconfigure what you think your life is about or what you think freedom consists in. So you bust down your own constraints in certain ways as an individual, right? Now, groups that we're parts of, they often have kind of stories that they tell about what our possibilities are for action and what freedom is for us, for different individuals. You see this at the level of the state. I mean, we go back to the 1910, before women could vote in the United States. Okay, freedom for women wasn't going to be about voting in that kind of a system. That was about taking care of children. That was the natural and proper role for women to play in society. And so there's a narrative about what a woman could still be free was the idea. It was just she couldn't be free in the way that a man was free. So there's this kind of a story about what people's potentials are, what their own freedom consists in. And so there's other constraints, and those are backed up by law, they're backed up by social convention, and so on. And so you're in one of those systems, and you're trying to be free, and you're a good person, so you do what a good woman tells you what a good woman's supposed to do. So you don't try to vote. You don't try to go to get a university education, and so those constraints are somehow imposed by grand narratives and then political systems that kind of enable certain people to do certain things and prevent those people from doing other things. And so you kind of have to find, in some ways, your own freedom in that until you throw off those systems. And that it would be a political revolution or some kind of political reform that basically says, no, we want to reconceive of what women's freedom is. Women should be free to vote. Women should have the same rights and entitlements as men. And then slowly those kinds of narratives change at that level. And as individuals, of course, we're subject to these big societal pressures, these big societal narratives. We internalize these things whether we want to or not. And so there's a kind of, I guess, a dialectic there between the dominant social narratives, the grand narratives, and the mini narratives that we tell ourselves, and the way we conceive of freedom kind of within the psychological kind of constraints that are normal. So, um, yeah. Now, the question I was going to say I was going to try to bend that into was that about what was it? Um, I wrote it down here. What was the question you were asking about Gestalt and telos, right? So the state has a certain form and the state has certain goals. So we could put it that way. The state in 1910 in the United States had a certain form and it allowed women to do certain things and men to do other things. And, so different kinds of citizens were enabled by the state to do certain kinds of things. That was the Constitution. That was, and from a Hegelian perspective, somewhat of an embodiment of the sensibilities of the people of that time, and that created its gestalt, and that affected the telos, and it affected the telos that the individuals in that state sort of developed for themselves as consciousnesses and so on and so forth. Now, what happened was that Constitution ran up against certain kinds of legitimacy, a legitimacy crisis of some sort, right? So people started not believing the narratives, and they said, well, why should it be that that's the only set of roles open for me? So then what happens from the view of the state is we set up a new gestalt with a new constitution, with new sensibilities about what women can do, new rights or opportunities. And so the people can conceive of freedom much more easily in those terms than they could have before. If you wanted to be a voter and you were a woman, or you wanted to go to become a medical doctor and you were a woman in 1910, it was going to be very hard. After 1920, it gets a little bit easier, into the 50s, 60s. But you have a kind of a shift in the sensibility of people. And that's reflected not only in stories, but also in like legal apparatuses and the kinds of things police arrest you for and put you in prison for, and so on. So I don't know. I think I'm doing Hegel, kind of a Hegelian perspective, some justice in talking about it in those terms. If you think I'm wrong, then let me know. It's not what Hegel said about the systems of, 1936 or whatever, 1830s that he was writing about. But the sensibility is kind of Hegelian.
So, regarding this idea of gestalt and telos, right? In architecture, there's this saying, form follows function, right? And Frank Lloyd Wright, who is the famous architect who built the Guggenheim Museum in New York City, the spiraling shaped museum, he said that form follows function that has been misunderstood. Form and function should be one, joined in a spiritual union. So, the reason I think this kind of discussion is relevant at the end here is a talk about freedom and determination of the boundaries of a system. It's kind of like form and function, right? The form is the boundary of a system, and the function, does it facilitate freedom? So what is the relationship between those two? Does the form follow the function? So what would that mean as far as determining the limits of certain systems? I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's relevant to think about it in that way. So,
May I add something I have learned from Goethe?
please, yeah.
Goethe was talking about Gestalt very often. And in his words, Gestalt has not been morphology, but a theory of transformation. So he said, Gestalt is something that is moving and changing and developing all the time. And of course, when we look out in nature, this is true. When we look to our organization, this is true. I'm becoming an old man, blah, blah, blah. So no way this is like this. So it was never static, it was always dynamic. And this brings me to the second point, this question of telos. And we had very long discussions, and I think I reminded myself of words of Aristotle. Of course, I have not read Aristotle, but a friend of mine has made a PhD on Aristotle. And Aristotle had this concept of entelecheia, I don't know what the English word is.
And
Entelechia,
entelekia, uh,
entelechia.
yeah.
And entelechia for Aristotle had two meanings. In the meaning in the praxis, I am the telos right now. Yeah? And in the autopoietic mode, he said, I am I who wants to go to the telos. So those were there in his philosophy. And I think both are always present in organic nature. Every animal is present in its being at every developmental stage. And every plant or animal somehow has also an aim to get adult, to reproduce, be it by seeds or whatever. And when I look into my inner, let's say, spiritual life, the same is present there. I must learn to laugh before I meditate myself. And this means to love the one I am. And in meditation, I realize that I am aspiring or I'm on a path to something I see maybe blurry, but I'm not there. So this is a telos. You understand? On one hand, I must accept the one I am. This is practice in this Aristotelian sense. And at the same time, in my inner exercise, I realize that I'm not still, although I say I am not the one I could be in the future. And of course, I will never be able to become the one I had been before. So, in a certain way, Gestalt, and this can be related for me to body, to soul, and mind, always something very dynamic. And there's always this notion of presence and always this notion of going the, towards the future. And for me, this is not well, maybe it's dialectic. It's not an opposition, these two views. They belong together.
Based on what you're saying, Dr. Wirz, it sounds like, based on that view of Gestalt, morphology is indeed the wrong word to use, but maybe ontogenesis is more
Maybe,
appropriate, right?
maybe, yeah.
The goal-directed process of becoming and the different stages of that process and how they relate to one another.
Mhm. Yes, the German word Goethe has used is Verwandlungslehre. I write it for you into the chat.
Ah,
I could not translate it easily.
okay.
Yeah, I think maybe different systems are a little bit different. I mean, we tend to think of human-built systems as, for a particular purpose, and so we create the gestalt, or the structure to achieve some end, right? And in the case of a hammer, it's to hit a nail or something like that. And so we've given it that purpose. Now, you might find that certain things that we create give us affordances to do other things with them, and maybe we tweak them a little bit or we change the technology over time. So that we didn't really realize when we made something that it might be useful for some other purposes. Um, and so then we end up changing those human built systems. But yeah, I think especially like you're saying, Johannes, um, human beings, um, I mean, many religions would say there's some ultimate purpose we discover, but uh, a lot of us are here kind of giving ourselves purposes, changing our from inside. We're
Mhm.
giving ourselves purposes, changing those purposes. We can't change our human body exactly in those ways. Um, but I liked what you said about how those transform over time.
Hegel, of course, is famous, perhaps infamous, for having said that form and content cannot be separated ultimately, right? That that the presentation of something over time is also its content, right? What it is. Though, of course, in the case of human beings, as Sauter picked up on, right? In the case of human beings, um, one is always free to say no, and this is in Hegel as well, no to what is, right? And at the, so you can imagine a person at the end of their life, on their deathbed saying, I did all that, but no, it's not me. You know, I'm really something else, even if, if I, if I did all that, and that, of course, having done all that does constitute, in a certain, who I am at the same time. I can't, as Hegel says, you if you deny all of that, there's no content left over, right? That is who you are from a certain point of view, everything you did, even if you're free to say, in some sense, to say, no, that's not me.
Mhm.
But one can only be other than what you were if you at the same time acknowledge that that's who you were, right? So anyway, I'll just stop there. I don't know if that's helpful.
This somehow really interesting discussions makes me think of if I think I would be a lake, an ecosystem, a forest, and I would say, okay, I emerge to reach the final goal to express myself, then I would, in one sense, uh, according to this view, uh, Aristotelian final cause and efficient cause would become essentially the same. So
Mhm.
is this already sort of a dialectical synthesis between those two? Or is there just, I mean, the theory is framed in a way that it doesn't really make sense? I don't know, but it seems like you can conflate efficient and final cause in a way that it might give the impression you have already a dialectical synthesis between those two causal mechanisms of Aristotle. Just thinking out loud, it might be completely off track here.
I mean, that was ultimately Hegel's view, right? That the concept of something, of what it is also its purpose in a certain sense, right? So the concept of hammer, to pick up on an earlier example, it also says what it is for, right? That's how one can have a bad hammer. Broken hammer is a bad hammer. And then at some point, if it falls far enough from what it's for, it becomes not a hammer at all. So the concept of something for Hegel is both an account of what, or it captures what it is, but also what it should be. It's telos. And that's true for, he thought anyway, in my view, for every concept. That it already meshes together, um, the the is claim, ontology, and telos, I guess, purpose. Yeah.
I think Aristotle held the same view because he said a hand severed from the body is not a hand. But it'd be interesting, you know, how do we scale that up to, okay, it's kind of easy to see what a hammer is for because we're the ones who made it. but but then and it's easy to see what a hand is for because we're the ones who use it. It's in the context of our own living activity. But then what would be the method for determining what is the purpose of the self as a totality? Um, that's, I think from the religious points of view, people would say, oh, well, that's what scripture is for. From the more meditational point of view, they might say, well, that's what introspection and yeah, introspection is for. That's what meditation is about. Is about quieting the mind, seeing what's there. I mean, I don't think we will ever arrive at a conclusive answer in this kind of group discussion, because each individual will resonate with different aspects of each perspective. They may they may live their life based on scripture, or based on their own internal development of self, or based on neither of those, and they prefer to follow the rules of society, or the particular way that their family raised them. So this dynamic, comes back to the individual and the environment, right? What is the dialectic relationship between the individual and the environment, and how the individual is shaped by the environment, but then how the individual reciprocally contributes to the environment, and through that has an effect on other individuals. So it's very humbling to, I think, talk about these things, because we can't reach a conclusion that that everyone will agree to, but it still feels nourishing to talk about them in some way, and then to see how they affect our individual application in whatever work we're doing when we come away from a talk like this. So I feel very fortunate to have taken part in this kind of discussion with all of you. And this is exactly what the Science and Scientists Conference series is all about. Coming to, how can science explain the experience of the scientist, rather than just having scientists give some explanation of reality? How can we incorporate more phenomenological experience of what depression is, in a way that complements and helps to bring our scientific analytic perspective to a higher level of that? How do we take this kind of open-ended, high-level discussion, and how does it come down to, which is more universal, right? And then how does it come back down to shape the individual instances of the manifestation of such kind of concepts and ideas? So I feel like this is exactly what a conference is supposed to be about, and I hope that all of you feel similarly. Before we start to wrap up, is there any other contributions anybody would like to make? Julie.
Krishna, like to say one word. We have learned a lot about ecosystems. And to end open-ended means that we have been building and forming an ecosystem where diversity is more important than monocrop unity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wirz. And Dr. Maybee put a comment in the chat. Hegel thought that possibility, chance, and contingency are never discharged within a system. Ultimately, a concept system simply integrates possibility. So randomness is, for him, built into the system itself. Thank you so much. I think forming a conclusion was never the point, more so a continuation, a commitment to continuation. What a wonderful space you are holding, Jai. So we will conclude our conference here today, and we will submit, we'll make individual videos from the recordings of the different talks, and then of this final panel discussion, and I'll share them with all of you via email. And I pray that we can all move towards more love, ultimately, right? Love, interconnection, wholeness. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.